And now, okay. So here we go. So welcome to this webinar, folks. I'm Kent Potter of Benya Group. I'm looking forward to a good 45 minutes with all of you today as we talk about decision culture analysis, what it is, how it works, and why we need it. First off, just a word about Benya Group. Nancy and I founded Benya Group in 20 years ago now. We'd previously worked in competitive intelligence and market research. And we figured out that probably the killer app of competitive intelligence was business to business influence, because in the B2B space, strategic influence is essential if you want to grow your revenues. And whether you're trying to work with strategic partners, suppliers, or prospects, it's absolutely essential. And so our focus these past 20 years has been to use intelligence data to help our clients get the market insight, foresight, and influence that they need. And one of the core tools here was actually decision culture analysis. So let's start out by talking why decision culture. What is it, and why decision culture at all? There's several key jobs to be done in our view that anyone in business has in front of them, and one of these is to anticipate company choices and to shape them. Now, this is true whether you're talking about your own company and you want them to make you want your senior executives to make a decision that is in your own and the company's best interest, or you're talking about a supplier whose success at supplying you with critical components is essential to your business, where you're talking about an important prospect or customer, anything of that kind, and you're thinking about a target company whose activities you must anticipate. And it's also true with the competitor, although you can't always persuade them to do what you want. We wish, right? But you're also thinking about trying to influence that company. Okay, so what do you want them to do? I'd like you to start out actually by thinking of a target company. Just come up with one in your mind, whether it's your own firm or another firm, a supplier or a competitor or somebody else. What do you want them to do? Why aren't they doing it? This is in the case of your company or a prospect, or for competitors, what will they most likely do and how can you outflank them? Those are the jobs to be done as we think about why decision culture is important. So what this webinar is about is to provide a basic framework for these three tasks: understanding your target, anticipating their behavior, and influencing their choices. Now, again, on item 3, it's very difficult to say that you're going to do that with competitors. You can message them and perhaps fool them, but it's unlikely that you're going to sway them in the same in-depth way that you can in working with a prospect or a supplier or a partner. But all of this reflects the Stephen R. Covey maxim: seek first to understand, then to be understood. That's habit 5 of his successful habits of 7 habits of successful people. You have to understand your target before you can hope that they'll understand you and be persuaded by your beliefs or insights. So think about this in terms of sales activities, whether you're giving a presentation to a prospect or internal to your own company. You make a great presentation, everything is going great, everything's wonderful, but something happens. The sale never goes through. What happens is you've given a well-crafted presentation. Everybody seems in alignment. They're nodding and smiling. You've answered their questions, but the decision to move forward never comes. The buyer doesn't buy. The executives never decide. Maybe they buy from a competitor. Maybe they do nothing. But you can't understand why, and you don't know which strings to pull to get things to go from there. I'm sure that that's happened to many of you. It certainly happened in my life many times. Or perhaps this has happened. You know exactly what you would do if you were the competitor. This actually, by the way, is how we first got started with decision culture. We were actually trying to answer the question of an important client who said, we're having a war game and we're going to play act different competitors in this war game, but how do I know what they'll actually do? I'm not them, I'm not in their shoes. I can say what I would do in their shoes, but I'm simply not them. How do we know? So how often does it happen that we think we know what they're going to do, but they do something totally different, totally unexpected from our point of view? Is there any way we can get a better crystal ball? Well, we think there is. So what we need to understand in complex sales is the client's business, really what makes it tick, where they get their principal profit from and why, the approval process, if we're trying to put a decision before them, and the decision process beyond the approval alone, just once something is approved, how do you get it all the way through to funding? This will help you, if you can do it right, find and win supporters and coaches over to your side and help you bring the right mindset, skills, and team to navigate and influence the political process. So usually when we fail to have something work out for us, we just wave it off as corporate politics. But what are corporate politics? What are those invisible guard rules and playbooks and constraints that keep us from getting what we want or anticipating the behavior that we think we see unfolding? The same is true on the competitor side. You have to understand what the competitor wants, but then you have to understand this black box called politics. What are the decision information preferences, the interpersonal influences? Only then can you actually anticipate competitor responses to your moves. Only then can you make changes to your strategy based on new intelligence as it comes in. So for clients, since many of you have to do some sales to someone sometime, whether you're doing competitor analysis or not, you need a clear picture of their business concerns, their decision processes, and their decision makers. But then with that, only with that, can you offer the specific help that fits the business and removes their concerns, talk to the right people about the right things, and give them the information that they need to motivate them to act. So I guess the question arises, don't we already have these tools? I mean, what's here are 6 typical tools used by companies to understand, if you will, to X-ray target organizations to understand them. For a long time, business schools have taught the importance, of organizational and leadership background analysis. How do organizations make decisions like the one that you have in mind? What roles have the leaders played in those decisions in the past? And who are the principal leaders and how do they think? The problem that we've had with organizational leadership background analyses, as we've seen them taught in the past, is frankly, they don't give enough detail about what you're looking for when you're doing this analysis. Nor do they tell you much about how that leader plays within their own organization. And unless you're dealing with an fully autocratic organization, a single leader rarely makes a key choice by themselves without influence of others or without collegial agreement on what should be done. Porter's 5 forces, I won't go through in depth. SWOT, I won't go through in depth. I suspect everybody on this call are familiar with these tools. Also, the same is true with Porter's 4 corners analysis, stakeholder analysis, and many of you may know the Miller-Hyman sales model, which is an excellent, really a superb model for understanding the role of different players in a complex sales cycle, such as the economic buyer, the technical buyer, the people who are going to be using it, coaches, and so on. This sales model has been well used in many places around the world, and it's highly effective. All of these work, but what's missing here? All these tools have a critical weakness in our view in common, and we're not rejecting these tools. We're saying we ought to add to them certain elements that will help make them work better and give us much deeper insight. First off, the observation is that to get the data that we need to understand how to apply these tools, we Google them. We Google the data. We Google the key insights that we need. Then we talk to our coworkers and associates and make a collective guess on how to interpret all of that. I used to teach an MBA course in competitive strategy and competitive intelligence. And in that course, we taught Porter's four corners analysis. And one of the things that we did there was one of those four corners is management assumptions and also business drivers. Those are two of the four corners. How do you really know what the management is thinking without asking them? Can you really tell by looking at the web and reading the 10K or the public reports for public companies? What do you do in the case of a private company? You can only guess. You can only say what you would do if you were them, and you're really not them. So this really doesn't give us the detail that we need. We're simply not close enough to see that detail. We can't really see the people that are making the choices or what drives them or what their assumptions are unless we get primary research involved. If we engage primary research, which it means interviewing people, talking to people that know the target, sometimes talking to the targets themselves, and talking to people that have bought from the company, sold to the company, or that supply the company. All of these people know something about how these people really think and what they really want. If we fail to get that information, we're really up a creek. This is particularly true for private companies, but even public companies who publish a great deal of information about their declared plans fail to reveal the sorts of data that we can only get through primary research. So here's a few rules of thumb. If you don't know who makes decisions about the problems, who really makes them, you can't influence those choices. So of course, there's usually a final decision maker, but there's only one person who can finally say yes. But in almost every major company, there are a lot of people who can say no. Who are they? And why would they say no to your proposal or say no to a course of action if you're talking competitive strategy? If you don't know the specific language and motivations of decision makers, and this is for salespeople, they may well not understand your solution or purchase it. You'll just talk right past them. Their eyes will glaze over and you'll lose them. You can't say with confidence why a competitor chose one course over another. You are only guessing. It's just a guess. You're not sure exactly. You're just saying what you would do in that case. So once again, interviews, primary research are a key aspect. So we're going to give you some key tools here in this webinar that will help you get started down this path. But first, I want to talk about the results that you can get from this. I want to give you a couple success stories. This was a number of years ago. We were working with a client, an American company. We're working with their Asian subsidiary. It's now part of Dow Chemical. It was purchased. It was Roman Haas, I can tell you. Roman Haas, which was the premier premium paint manufacturer in the world, really, in many people's assessment, was purchased by Dow Chemical. But before then, it had substantial operations as a manufacturer in various places around the world. And one of those places was in Asia Pacific. They had a company, we'll call them Emulsion Co., in a major Asian market, who wanted to make their own emulsion. Emulsion is kind of the Intel inside, if you will, the secret sauce that makes paint work. And this particular company wanted to make their own emulsion and then vertically integrate into their process of making their own paint. So what we did is we analyzed the Emulsion Co.'s decision processes, developed an influence plan with our client, and the result was, using these tools, the Emulsion Co. decided that they would not build their own plant, but actually Emulsion Co. is the Emulsion Co. is not the client. Emulsion Co. is Roman Haas, but the Roman Haas client decided that they would go ahead and stick with Roman Haas as a result of our efforts. In a similar way, we had an excellent experience with a major airline who was in a powerful battle with a union who demanded a gigantic, untenable pay raise of 50%. By analyzing union leaders' decision culture and understanding their mindset, we worked out ways to communicate with them that dramatically changed their approach, saving the airline over $500,000 a month on fuel, and they canceled a proposed strike. This was a great success. So this stuff really works. So what are some first principles here? Here's the foundational insights. Companies are organic. They're made out of people, not line and block charts, not formalized decision roles, but companies naturally grow decision processes within an overall culture, a culture of how they do things and what matters. But these patterns of how choices are made and resources are allocated are the basis of decision culture. These patterns are predictable, and you can build an analytical model around these predicted processes. But none of this works unless you can feed the model with deep insights from networking and interviews, network and interviews that come from primary research. Decision culture itself is a subset of corporate culture. So if you think about culture in general, these are patterns of behavior in which we not only transmit knowledge to succeeding generations, but in the case of companies, the way we decide what can and should be done within a particular organization and why. It's just the way we do things. I don't know about you, but a lot of times when I've gone to work with a new company, I'm told that's not the way we do things, or this is the way we do things around here. When we make decisions, we involve certain people and certain information. We involve certain types of information, and we process it in a certain way at a certain speed, and that is how we make our decisions. That's the operating system of company decision making. This is somewhat analogous to, by the way, I have no idea why on my screen I have these two blue lines. I can't seem to get rid of them, so my apologies. If you think about a computer's central processing unit and the way an operating system works in conjunction with that, you might consider a very simplistic model of that to look like this. The decisions are actually made by the CPU, but it only understands ones and zeros. The operating system is the software that translates the data that's coming in from the outside world into language that the CPU can understand. It comes in from the outside world through external devices and input mechanisms, is interpreted by applications, and then applied by the operating system through a series of touches and interrupts that cause the operating system to help the CPU interpret it to make a choice about what to do and how to use it. The output then is something that we would call a decision, a choice. The words appear on a page, the analysis is complete, the Excel formula works. If you're thinking about decision culture, it's a little bit like that. The CPU you might consider to be the final decision makers. surrounding these decision makers, there's concentric rings of leaders who are affected by this bit in red, which we're calling the decision culture. This is such things as the company's market orientation, the constraints they operate under, the playbook, their goals, their objectives, and then there's an industry culture that influences all of that, and a national culture that influences that. So if you think about that just for a moment, I'm sure many of you have worked with companies that come from different industries. You'll notice that, for example, industry culture, we're here focused on decision culture, but industry culture has a big impact on how companies make choices. For example, chemical companies tend to be very cautious and often very slow in their decision making because safety is a key issue. Everybody wants to avoid another Bhopal disaster as you think about the terrible chemical plant explosion in India so many years ago. So they're very slow to make choices often, and they consider things carefully. If you think about the tech industry, it'll move much faster. National culture, again, tends to be a big influence here. We have a number of people from other continents on this call. I think many of you may see the Americans as somewhat of cowboys, ready, fire, aim. I don't blame you for thinking that. We tend to move fairly quickly sometimes in some of our business choices, sometimes rashly perhaps. But then again, if you go into some countries in Europe, those very same companies, or companies in the very same industry would move very much more slowly and sometimes might miss market because they're moving so slowly. And Americans might miss market because they misfired. So national culture affects things as well. So let's get down to the nitty-gritty here. What are the key elements that we're going to focus on in decision culture analysis? There's actually many of these. There's about 16 of them. We're only going to focus on a few of them, and we split them up into groups here. The first is we're going to refer to as market orientation. And the second we're going to refer to as organizational constraints and playbook. So if your competitor has key issues, and we're going to talk about each of these, that are sort of elemental problems facing the business, and you don't know anything about what those are, and you don't know what their principal objectives are in the business, or what their recipe is for success, how they define success and how they measure it, your competitor action forecast, whether that's your client or your competitor, if you're forecasting behavior or pitching a proposal, if you don't get it right, if you put something together that does not address their key issues in any way or that is out of sync with the recipe for success, it is highly likely to misfire. You'll misguess the competitor, or you will entirely misalign with the client and lose the deal. Now, what is the organizational constraints and playbook? Well, if you're thinking about constraints that are implicit inside an organization, you need to think in terms of what we call tribal culture, which we'll describe, leader-group relationships, how leaders work with groups, or how people know what they know and make the decisions that they make. So this is all about, can they even make a particular choice that you're forecasting they'll make, or buy your product, or agree to accept your proposal? Over here, however, when you think about can they hear you and will you sway them, that has a lot to do with the individuals you're pitching to. This is on the sales or the prospecting side. You have to be able to make sure that the language that you use resonates with them, that it will really catch their interest, convince them, and motivate them to act. If you put all these steps in context, here's what you see. The very first step in this process, which is a multi-step process, is to make sure that you have clear business goals, and critically, that you design the outputs of your study from the very beginning. What is it that you will do with the results? How will you use it? Let's make sure from the start that you know exactly what questions you're asking and why and how you'll use the result. This whole process, by the way, is really only worthwhile if you're facing a significant competitor or a significant market opportunity, because it's costly and takes time. I'm not just saying hiring the consultant, it just takes time for you to do. Then there's considerations of decision history. Now, this is akin to work that is typically done in leadership and organizational choice analysis. But one of the considerations that you must think about here is core group size, and we'll touch on that further in a minute. Then we have the market orientation, the playbook and organizational constraints, followed by language and behavioral analysis and making a plan for competitive strategy or influence. So those are the 6 steps in context. We're not going to talk about this last one in much depth. We'll just introduce it. We're really going to focus in this webinar right here. So the very first step is to look at the formal versus the observed decision processes. Most companies, if you ask them, will say that they have a formalized decision process. And many people actually refer you to the organizational chart or make references to who's in what role. That's not always an accurate portrayal of how the decision process will be made. Important players may not even be shown in the formal structure. So we did a study years ago of, I think it was Samsung. And at Samsung, at that time, we discovered that one of the key players in the decision process on large strategic investments that the company made was the chauffeur of the company president. He was an astute observer. He ferried the top brass of the company everywhere that they went. He didn't just work for the company president, and he listened quietly while they spoke, and he was able to give advice to that top executive about which way he thought things ought to go. And that key executive listened. What a surprise that was. Group decision size, the rule of 5 to 9. If you think about it, there's a lot of data around this. Human beings really do a good job with 5 to 9 close friends. So it's really 7 plus or minus 2 is what we're talking about. If you think about many phone numbers in many countries, it's no more than that. It might have something to do with the digits on our hands and toes. It's not clear why this is, but people seem to remember lists of less than 10 better, in fact, closer to 7, better than they do lists of 15 or 12 or anything else. So if you have a large committee that's making a decision, say 12 people, you can be fairly sure that not all those 12 people will be key to the decision. Many will be bit players, and many won't even have veto power, let alone approval power. The model here, what we're talking about here is there's 4 core alternative models for decision making. One is called rational, which emphasizes formal data inputs and structured choice. Political, which focuses on, excuse me, I thought I had killed this, which focuses on political inputs and influence. Incremental, which emphasizes organizational precedent. And garbage can, which emphasizes urgency. Last in, first out. Which is it? How does your target company make its choices? Also, the speed of decision making is important. We talked about speed a little bit earlier. This now becomes a critical point of analysis. What are the main obstacles to profit or to growth? What are the existential issues facing the company that must be solved to enable it to continue? So here's really something to consider. This is why we said that it's critical that we understand exactly what it is that makes a company tick before you try to present a proposal. You can see why, if you can't address these issues, what you anticipate in terms of their behavior or what you offer them as an alternative may not fly. Nancy, over to you.
Oh, right. On the what makes a company tick list, the recipe for success. This is so different among different companies. It may be that they consider themselves profitable. I mean, that they consider themselves successful if they're making a profit, or if their revenue sheet is going up. It may be growth, and how much growth do they need to feel successful? It could be market share. Some companies are absolutely bent on raising their market share no matter what it does to the profit end of things. It could be the price of their shares or the earnings their shares are making. It might be market capitalization. It might be other. When we were working on doing decision culture analysis on a large Japanese electronics company, we found, interestingly enough, that that company measured success by how often their executives showed up in the technology media. All right. You can think of each organization like a tribe. Every tribe is a little bit different. Each tribe has its values, the things it believes in and pushes, its heroes, its legends, rites and rituals that help them decide how things are done around here. And there's ceremonies and symbols, the things that the company stands for. Tribal cultures. Here are some examples of this. Values. Southwestern Airlines, when it first came into being, decided they were going to be the low-cost airline. That was their one main value. And anything that came along, like someone saying, you know, I think our passengers would really at least appreciate getting peanuts. They'd say, will peanuts help us become the low-cost airline? No, forget the peanuts. That's a company's values. They're heroes. At Apple, of course, Steve Jobs was, for most of its history, their hero. He got innovation from market insight by figuring out what features people were going to want and what gadgets people were going to want, and innovating in that direction. Everybody wanted to follow that kind of innovation. Their rites and rituals, how things are done in many direct selling companies, direct sales companies. The heroes are the very top sellers, the ones who sell millions of dollars of product per year for their companies. Those people almost become like tribal chieftains, and basically what they say goes in the company. Ceremonies and symbols. American Airlines still talks about the day that their former CEO, about 10 years ago, was their CEO, spent a day loading baggage with the baggage handlers and standing behind the counter with agents, just doing the work of people at the airlines. That became one of the symbols of how things are done around here. Another company was, it's an electronics company. When somebody in their company came up with a great idea that the company used, they would give that person a monetary bonus, but they also gave them a little rubber ducky. And those little rubber duckies became very important symbols. If you had a rubber ducky on your desk, it meant you were the great person. Ceremonies and symbols. Another thing to know about a company is the leader and group interaction. How is the company run? Who makes the decisions? autocratic, consultative, collaborative, democratic, consensus. These are the major headings. Interestingly enough, we discovered when we were in China like 8 years ago or something, that privately run companies were run autocratically. The CEO, who was usually the founder of the company or whose family owned the company, was absolute king and made all the final decisions. However, state-run companies were completely consensus run. That way, if a stupid decision was made and the state came and said, that was a really stupid decision, the CEO did not get axed. He could say, but it was consensus within the company. It's important to know how the decisions are made in that company. Knowledge culture. How do leaders know what they know? How do they find out? Who do they trust? What is the input that they want to get? And who do they get it from? The best story on this one is the chauffeur that Kent already mentioned, who was able to tell his CEO all of the important things that he learned from other executives and from executives of other companies that he drove around as he listened to their conversations in the back seat. A lot of people trust what they hear on the golf course. Some choose one news source or another. It's important to know where the input comes from. And finally, for my piece, risk culture. How much risk is that company willing to take? This is supposed to be a picture of a tsunami coming in. You just kind of have to imagine that. Is that company a risk taker? Is it risk averse? We worked several years ago for a chemical company that needed to be able to grow. They were just kind of stagnating. And so we worked with the company and consulted with the company and came up with a list. And we said, okay, now here are some of the things we think you need to do. This is the biggest and most important that will make a huge difference. And privately, we were thinking, we can't believe you're not already doing this. But the people who hired us kind of shook their heads and said, you know, the C-suite will never go for this. We said, why on earth not? They said, well, about 5 years ago, somebody in this division made a decision which was a bit of a risk, but it turned out to be a spectacular failure and almost took the division down with it. Now the executives in this division are scared to do anything. So we're lucky if we can move the needle by an inch. They would never accept a big step forward like this. Ken.
So we're throwing a lot at you in a hurry. I think it's important to recognize that all of this together, probably we recognize that all of this together is just a little bit much. Usually it's a good idea to, and we've done this, put the different questions you're asking as some kind of template and specifically filter your answers to understand which of them has the most impact on helping any particular company make its decisions. That usually comes in a workshop in which we try to sort out what matters most out of all the different options. But the questions that are asked that are in these concepts we've been sharing with you are the key questions that lie behind any analysis of a company's decision culture. When you're done with the actual profiling of the organizational decision structure, it's time to move on to profile the key decision makers. You've already identified who the key people are that make choices within the firm and who can say yes and who can give a definitive no and who matters most. But only by analyzing what words and phrases will capture and retain their interest or turn them off or get them to act will you be able to actually sway them, or in some cases, understand what they're going to do if they're a competitor and outflank them. So we don't have time on this call to go through this. This is another webinar that we'll do at a future point. This is actually, each of these things we've introduced to you are actually a couple of days of training in order to get done right. But there are 10 key traits out of many that should be considered when you're thinking about language and behavioral analysis, which comes from the world of neurolinguistic programming. I'm just going to use one as an example, towards and away from, and I'll tell you what I mean by that so you can understand what I'm talking about. So people who are towards people work towards goals or pleasure and use words like obtain, have, get, include, achieve. Away from, they avoid mistakes or pain, and they like to exclude or steer away from problems. If you think about where you like to go on vacation and what your holidays look like, if you tend to go to the same place every year, or if you tend to go to get away from work rather than go to a particular location of pleasure, you might be an avoid person. That doesn't mean, that's not negative. You're just avoiding difficulty, and you might not be a toward person going to some exotic location that really attracts you. If you give a presentation to a decision maker that's all about everything they could obtain or attain, instead of talking about the pain they could avoid, and if they are an away person, their eyes will definitely glaze over. Okay, this information again comes from primary research. Written or broadcast media helps, but previous subordinates, peers, colleagues, neighbors even, but certainly clients, prospects, and suppliers are key here in understanding this. We're really pretty much done with this webinar. This is all the time that we'd allocated. I guess I'd like to ask you if you have any questions, if you're willing to unmute. We have another webinar that we plan on doing in the future on language and behavioral analysis more in depth, how to understand and persuade key leaders. So I'd like to ask if there's any questions that you have at this time in the last minute remaining to us. You can also put your email, your questions in via email or chat. Oh, I see some questions. All right. No, I'm not seeing any questions. It's time to end, folks. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you in the future. Have a wonderful Thursday.
Just a reminder that we will send some follow-up information pertaining to this webinar.
Yes, thank you. We will send some follow-up information out on this topic. Thank you much.
Thank you for coming. Bye.
Thank you, Ken.
Bye now.